Hi, everybody. Wow, Mom, I'm really doing this. I didn't wear pants, so I couldn't poop them. And I'm really glad to have my students in the audience today to help me out. I'm glad about a few other things, too. There's been a lot of really positive talk in this room about designing for good, making change. And the change I'm here to talk about today is reconciliation. And I've heard three things that you may not have heard since you've been there that I find really encouraging. Well, actually, you heard one, which was Jonathan, 2 days in a row, has done a really heartfelt acknowledgement of the land that we're on, the land that's not ours, the land that we stole. And he doesn't say it like he was reading a script. He said it like he meant it, and that's really important. Second great thing I heard was that there are apparently, there's a think tank here from the Seabird Island First Nations Band. Are any of those people here right now? Awesome! So glad that you're here. And the third thing that I learned today is that I'm sure all of you know, or at least you will know from now on, that June is actually Indigenous Peoples Month in Canada now, and that the GDC would like to feature the work of Indigenous designers on its website during the month of June. So if there are Indigenous designers in the room, or if people here know Indigenous designers who do great work, please reach out to GDC BC. Mr. Raj is their new communications chair, and he would love to hear from you, okay? So we're going to talk about reconciliation. So my name's Judy. I teach at in the Idea School of Design at Capilano University, and for the last 3 years, I've been running a project around reconciliation with our students. We've been doing this in collaboration with the Indigenous Independent Filmmaking Program, known as IIDF at CAP. It's been a real privilege to work with them. Their students have a lot in common with our students. They're all image makers who want to become storytellers. But for some of them, that's pretty much where a lot of the things in common end, because their experience, and there they are, their experience growing up in Canada has been so different to the experience of many of my students. And for many of them, entering post-secondary education is not just something, hey, do I want to go to school or start working at Starbucks? It's actually a huge leap and a huge obstacle for some of them to do that. So I feel so grateful that they are actually willing to give up some of their time to help us be better at reconciliation, which really, it's not their job to help us, it's our job to help them because we screwed things up for them in the first place. So the first thing that we did in year one, which was 2016, was the two schools got together and we went on a field trip to the Museum of Vancouver, where there's an exhibit called Sgsmåm, City Before the City. It's still there. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's not a big exhibit, but it's really good, and it will really help you understand what Vancouver was like and what we've done to this land. So before we did that on the first day, the Indigenous film students actually put my students in front of the camera, and they said, what do you really know about First Nations? And it turned out that they really didn't know very much at all. It turned out that the 94 calls to the action in the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report have really not seeped into our everyday at all very much so far. However, recent changes to the K-12 curriculum hopefully mean that very soon we will see changes in that, at least in the field of education. So working with them, we learned a lot about what's going on in Canada, and we learned a lot about some of the mistakes that we need to make up for. So every year I've asked my students a super vague brief. You hate clients that give you vague briefs, right? My students, some of them really hate it too, but what I'm finding, for as much as they hate it, the results that I can get are incredible sometimes. They blow me away. So I ask them simply, from what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've learned, what you've researched yourself, choose something that you connected with and figure out how you could best communicate that to other people. So in 2016, first year we did it, Jess Pollard, she was fascinated by the First Nation stories. And she was fascinated how so many of them were connected to place, like the story of how the two mountains in Vancouver became the two lions. So she decided to create a storytelling app. And she thought this app would be great. If you go for a walk in Vancouver, you could have the app, and then you could pay maybe 99 cents, and you could download a story that related to the place where you were actually standing. And her hope was, and again, no direction from me, I can't take any credit, her hope was that through that money that was downloaded, that money could be used to fund First Nations causes and defend their culture. This year, 3 students worked together, Bryn Staples, Courtney Lamb, and Emily Hoon. They also came up with an app also related to place. Theirs used geolocation technology so that people could actually find themselves in a specific place, and they could click on the app, and they could have an experience using augmented reality to kind of get a sense of what was going on in these places for thousands of years. Rebecca Maurice was also very interested in place, but she decided on a different target audience. She decided she'd come up with a card game called Shared. And the idea of her game was that students should learn about how different First Nations interacted differently with the land in different parts of what was Turtle Island that we decided to call Canada. And the game would teach students about all the different natural resources that First Nations people used. In her game, she had question cards where they would answer questions about various elements of First Nations life and First Nations culture, and through that, they would actually get cards which were their resources, so salmon to eat, fur to clothe themselves, etc. 2016, Pamela Pinard and Max Littledale worked together. They were, after talking to the First Nation students, they were concerned about the loss of culture, and particularly what the loss of language, the involvement that has had with loss of culture. So they decided to create a website that would bring awareness to that. And then they created a poster campaign that would bring awareness to the website. They used the Indigenous students as inspiration for this, and they also used them as models in their photography. This year, Atrine Yazdani-Biyuki was horrified to learn about the terrible living conditions on First Nations reserves. She decided to come up with a guerrilla campaign for the Red Cross. She thought she could maybe bring these things that are out of sight, out of mind, in from remote places and stick them squarely in our faces in the center of the city. I thought her idea was really hard-hitting and really hard to avoid. Ata Ojani this year decided he would use the caustic humor of Cards Against Humanity to really, again, bring it into our faces and say, what do we really know and what do we really think about residential schools and all these things that have happened and that are still happening. So he made people make awful choices between bad answers to horrifying questions. And at the same time, he taught people, this is how you can help. This is where you can go for information. So a really constructive approach. Oh, here we go. Ashley Visvanathan, she also wanted to deal with these distorted perceptions. So she created a poster campaign for high school hallways where students could reconsider perhaps the misconceived ideas they've learned from family and friends, and that they could be led to the Reconciliation Canada website where they could find out accurate information about how First Nations people really get their education and do they really pay taxes and all those things. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about Teresa Cantu Villalobos, who decided to piggyback on the Red Dress campaign, which if you don't know it, figure it out. She decided to address the issue of the lack of attention to the missing and murdered women issues. And her idea was to pre-print Post-it notes that could be sold in coffee shops and other places, and that she would encourage people then going about their daily lives to just stick these Post-it notes where people would see them. And then she hoped that through social media, they would then share these Post-it notes, either the ones they posted or the ones they saw, and using the hashtag #MeetHer, that hashtag would lead people to the CBC's Missing and Murdered Women website, which strangely, is one of the few places that you can actually find out good information about these women who are mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. And perhaps the most hard-hitting of our applications was to stick these Post-its, giant size, on the back of trucks as they drive around the highways of Canada, the same highways where a lot of these women have disappeared. So there was a very surprising outcome from all of this. Not that my students ended up more empathetic or more knowledgeable about First Nations issues. What shocked me was that the First Nations students were actually really surprised that we were doing this project. They were surprised that we cared. They were surprised that my students were so passionate, and they were surprised that my students were willing to give up so much time to learn about their issues. And that, for me, gets to kind of the root of the problem of where we're at today. So now that you know that June is Indigenous Month in Canada, I'm going to challenge you with 5 things that you can do if you haven't already done them. And I've posted these on the RGD DT Slack resources page so that you don't need to write them down. These are things that all of you can do as part of your reconciliation, so that hopefully next year when we come back to Design Thinkers, everyone in this room will feel like they've actually done something. In the words of Chief Robert Joseph, only when we make reconciliation a core value in our daily lives are we going to create a narrative that will help us get there. So it's up to all of us as designers or just human beings living in Canada to do whatever we can. Thank you.